The diner was bustling with the usual morning crowd, truck drivers sipping coffee, families enjoying pancakes, and locals catching up on the latest gossip. Among them sat an older man, his weathered face quietly observing the world around him. His name was Joe, a retired veteran who had seen more than most in his lifetime. He had his usual spot by the window, where sunlight streamed in, glinting off the modest military insignia pin on his jacket. Joe wasn't one for attention, and he certainly wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble has a way of finding those who least deserve it. The bell over the diner door jingled, and in walked a group of young men. Their loud laughter cut through the warm hum of the place, drawing every eye. They wore confidence like armor, strutting to a booth in the center of the room, their voices echoing with the kind of arrogance that demands to be noticed. At first, Joe paid them no mind. He'd seen men like them before, brash, bold, and more bark than bite. But it wasn't long before their conversation took a turn. "Check out the old-timer," one of them said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet he thinks he's some kind of hero or something." Joe's ears caught the words, but he didn't react. Years of discipline had taught him the value of restraint. He focused on his cup of coffee, his hand steady, even as the group's taunts grew louder. "Hey, Grandpa!" Another one called out, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "What's the medal for? Winning a bingo game?" The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. People in the diner exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting in their seats, others pretending not to notice. A waitress paused mid-step, her tray trembling slightly, unsure of whether to intervene. Joe took a deep breath, the kind that comes from someone who's been through worse and knows better than to react to provocations. But the young men weren't about to let it go. One of them got up, sauntering over to Joe's table with a smirk plastered across his face. "You deaf or something, old man? We're talking to you." The room grew tense. Conversation stopped, forks paused mid-air, and all eyes turned to the unfolding scene. Joe finally looked up, his gaze meeting the young man's with a calmness that was almost unnerving. "I heard you," Joe said quietly. His voice was steady, measured, carrying a weight that made the younger man hesitate for a split second. "But arrogance is a stubborn thing." The young man leaned in closer, his smirk widening. "So, what's your deal, huh? You think you're better than us because you played soldier a million years ago?" Joe's eyes didn't waver, but his grip on the coffee cup tightened just slightly. He wasn't one to seek confrontation, but he also wasn't one to back down when pushed too far. And as the diner watched, holding its collective breath, it became clear, these bullies had no idea who they were messing with or what Joe was capable of. The diner felt like it had shrunk, the air thick with a silence that carried more weight than any words could. All eyes were on Joe and the young man towering over him, but Joe didn't flinch. He stayed seated, his steady gaze fixed on the bully, as if he were assessing him, peeling back the layers of bravado to see the truth beneath. Joe's calm demeanor only seemed to irritate the young man more. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of frustration, but he masked it quickly with a laugh. "What's the matter, old-timer? Cat got your tongue?" Joe set his coffee cup down carefully, the clink of ceramic on the table sharp in the quiet room. His voice was low but firm when he finally spoke again. "Respect is earned, son. And judging by the way you're acting, you've got a lot of work to do." The bully's friends let out a chorus of exaggerated oohs, but their leader wasn't amused. His face reddened, and his smirk twisted into a sneer. "You've got a smart mouth for someone who's clearly past his prime." Joe didn't rise to the bait, and that only seemed to frustrate the young man more. He leaned in closer, invading Joe's space, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think you're tough? Huh? Let me guess, you've got some war stories you tell yourself to feel important." The words stung, not because Joe doubted his own worth, but because he knew the weight behind the stories he didn't tell. Memories flashed through his mind, faces of comrades who didn't make it back, nights spent under enemy fire, and the quiet sacrifices that would never be recognized by those who hadn't lived it. But Joe wasn't about to explain himself to a kid who had no idea what he was talking about. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying the young man with an expression that was almost pitying.
You've got no idea what you're saying, do you?
The bully straightened, caught off guard by the unexpected response. His bravado faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, laughing it off and turning to his friends.
Can you believe this guy? Acting like he's some kind of war hero or something. One of his friends chimed in, maybe he thinks he's in a movie. You know, the part where the grizzled vet saves the day?
The group erupted in laughter, and the tension in the diner shifted. Some of the other patrons exchanged uneasy looks, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but no one dared to step in. It wasn't just fear of the bullies, it was the way Joe carried himself. There was something about him, an unshakable presence that hinted he didn't need anyone's help. The waitress, a young woman named Emily, finally mustered the courage to intervene. She approached the table cautiously, her hands gripping the edges of her tray.
Hey, why don't you guys leave him alone?
She said, her voice shaking slightly but firm enough to show she meant it. The leader turned his attention to her, his sneer softening into a smirk.
Relax, sweetheart. We're just having a little fun.
It doesn't look like he's having fun, Emily shot back, surprising even herself with her boldness. Joe glanced at her, his expression softening. He gave her a small nod, a silent gesture of appreciation, but before he could say anything, the bully stepped closer to her, his tone taking on a condescending edge. You should stick to taking orders, honey.
This doesn't concern you.
Joe's hand tightened into a fist under the table, but he kept his voice calm when he spoke.
That's enough.
The bully turned back to him, his eyes narrowing.
Or what? You gonna teach me a lesson, old man? Joe didn't respond right away.
Instead, he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. For the first time, the young man realized just how tall Joe was, how broad his shoulders were, even with the years that had softened them. Joe's eyes locked onto his, and there was something in them that made the bully hesitate. You don't want to go down this road, Joe said quietly. The room was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the diner's wall clock.
The bully's bravado wavered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down.
He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the upper hand. Big talk for someone who's clearly seen better days. Joe tilted his head slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips.
You're right. I have seen better days. But I've also seen worse. Much worse.
The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The bully's friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in power even if their leader refused to acknowledge it. But before the situation could escalate further, the sound of a car pulling into the diner's parking lot broke the tension. Everyone turned to look as a black SUV rolled to a stop, its sleek exterior gleaming in the sunlight. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a crisp suit, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene through the diner's windows. Joe's eyes narrowed slightly, recognition flickering across his face. The man locked eyes with him, and for a moment, it was as if the rest of the diner didn't exist. Who was this man? And why did Joe look like he knew exactly who he was? The diner seemed frozen in time, all eyes shifting between Joe and the man who had just stepped out of the SUV. The sleek vehicle looked out of place in the gravel-strewn parking lot, and the man's polished shoes didn't belong in a place where most patrons wore scuffed boots or sneakers. He stood tall and confident, his gaze steady as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bell jingled softly, but the sound barely registered over the tension that gripped the room. The man's sharp eyes scanned the diner, taking in every detail. The bullies clustered near Joe's table, the nervous waitress, and Joe himself, who stood tall and unyielding. Joseph, the man said, his voice smooth but carrying a weight that made the name feel like a command. Joe's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond right away. The familiarity in the man's tone was clear, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of familiarity that spoke of a shared past, a complicated one. The leader of the bullies, sensing an opportunity to shift the attention away from his crumbling bravado, crossed his arms and smirked. Who's this guy, your backup? Didn't think you'd need someone to fight your battles for you, old man. The man in the suit didn't even glance at him. Instead, he walked further into the diner, his measured steps echoing against the tiled floor. His gaze remained fixed on Joe, and for a moment, the two seemed to be having a silent conversation that no one else could hear. "Didn't expect to find you here," the man said finally, his tone carrying a hint of something almost like amusement, though his expression stayed cold.
"Thought you'd retired from situations like this."
Joe's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained sharp.
"I didn't expect to see you, either. But life has a funny way of bringing people back together."
The man gave a small, humorless chuckle.
"It does, doesn't it?"
He gestured toward the Bullies with a slight tilt of his head.
"And it seems you found yourself in the middle of a situation, as usual." The leader of the Bullies bristled, clearly annoyed at being dismissed.
He stepped forward, pointing a finger at the man.
"Hey, pal, this doesn't concern you. Why don't you keep walking before you end up regretting it?"
For the first time, the man turned his attention to the young bully. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made the bully take a small step back, almost instinctively.
"Regret?"
The man said quietly, his voice calm but carrying an edge that sent a shiver through the room.
"You don't know the meaning of the word." Joe's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Careful, Mark. They don't know what they've stepped into." Mark shrugged, his attention returning to Joe. "Maybe it's time they learned."
The leader of the Bullies tried to recover, his voice rising to mask his unease.
"You think you're tough because you've got a suit and a fancy car? You don't scare me."
Mark took a step closer, his presence almost suffocating as he loomed over the bully.
"Oh, I'm not here to scare you.
I'm here to see how far you're willing to go.
Because I can promise you, this man," he gestured toward Joe, "has seen and done things that would make you wish you'd stayed home today."
The bully opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to die in his throat. His friends shifted uncomfortably behind him, their earlier bravado evaporating under the weight of the tension. Joe broke the silence, his voice calm but firm.
"That's enough, Mark. They've made their point, even if they don't realize it yet."
Mark glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing his face.
"You're letting them off easy."
Joe's expression hardened.
"They don't need to learn that lesson the hard way. Not today."
The leader of the Bullies, sensing an opportunity to regain some control, laughed nervously.
"Yeah, that's what I thought. You're all talk."
Mark's eyes narrowed, but Joe stepped forward, placing himself between the bully and Mark. "Go home, kid," Joe said, his voice low but carrying a finality that left no room for argument.
"You've already gotten more than you bargained for." The bully hesitated, glancing between Joe and Mark.
His pride told him to push back, but his instincts told him to walk away. Finally, he scoffed and turned toward his friends.
"Come on, let's get out of here. This place is a joke."
The group shuffled out of the diner, their swagger noticeably diminished. The bell jingled as the door closed behind them, and the tension in the room eased slightly. Mark watched them go, his expression unreadable.
"You're too soft, Joe,"
he said finally, his tone almost teasing. Joe sighed, his shoulders relaxing as he sat back down at his table.
"And you're still too quick to escalate. Some things never change." Mark chuckled, though it lacked real humor. "Maybe. But some things do."
The cryptic comment hung in the air, and Joe studied Mark carefully. There was something unspoken between them, something heavier than the events of the last few minutes.
Before either could say more, the waitress, Emily, approached cautiously. "Is everything okay now?"
she asked, her voice tentative but brave.
Joe gave her a reassuring nod. "It's fine, Emily. Thanks for stepping in earlier."
Mark glanced at her, offering a faint smile.
"You handled yourself well. Not everyone would have spoken up." Emily blushed slightly, ducking her head. "I just couldn't stand to see them treating you like that." Joe's eyes softened.
"It takes courage to stand up when it's easier to stay quiet.
Don't lose that."
Emily nodded, her nerves settling as she returned to her duties. Mark pulled out a chair and sat across from Joe, his expression turning serious. "You've still got it, I'll give you that. But I didn't come here to catch up. We need to talk." Joe's eyes darkened slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. "I figured as much. Let me guess you've got a problem that needs solving, and I'm the only one who can help." Mark didn't answer right away, his silence speaking volumes. "Finally," he said, "it's more complicated than that." Joe sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It always is." The tension that had temporarily eased was back, heavier than before. Whatever Mark had come to say, Joe knew it wasn't going to be good. Joe sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Mark. There was something in the man's tone that put him on edge, something unspoken but heavy. Mark wasn't the kind of person to show up out of nowhere unless there was a reason, and that reason was rarely simple. Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping low. "It's not just a problem, Joe. It's our problem." Joe's jaw tightened, and his hand gripped the edge of the table. He didn't like the sound of that. "I've been out of the game for a long time, Mark. Whatever you're dealing with, it's not my problem anymore." Mark shook his head, his expression unreadable. "You don't get it. You're already involved." The words hit Joe like a punch to the gut, though his face betrayed nothing. He had spent years distancing himself from the kind of life Mark was referring to, leaving behind the chaos, the danger, and the constant battle to stay one step ahead. Whatever Mark was about to say, Joe knew it wasn't going to be good. "I don't know what you're talking about," Joe said, his tone cold. Mark leaned back in his chair, letting out a humorless laugh. "You've been out for so long, you don't even see it, do you? That kid in here just now, the one trying to prove he's tough? He's not some random punk, Joe. He's connected." Joe frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Connected to what?" Mark's face darkened, and for a moment, he hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Finally," he said, "to people who want you gone." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Joe didn't flinch, but inside, his mind was racing. He had made his share of enemies over the years, people who didn't take kindly to his role in dismantling their operations, exposing their secrets, or standing in the way of their plans. But he had done his best to disappear, to leave that life behind. "I've been out for a decade," Joe said quietly. "Why would anyone still care about me?" Mark's expression hardened. "Because some grudges don't fade, and some people never forget. They've been looking for you, Joe. Watching. Waiting for the right moment to draw you out." Joe's stomach tightened, though his face remained calm. "And you're saying that kid was part of it? A setup?" Mark nodded. "Not him specifically. He's just a pawn, young, reckless, easy to manipulate. But the people pulling his strings? They knew he'd get under your skin. They're testing you, seeing if you're still the man they remember." Joe exhaled slowly, his mind racing as he tried to piece it together. "Why now? What's changed?" Mark hesitated, and Joe caught the flicker of unease in his expression. "Because something big is coming. I don't know all the details yet, but I know enough to see the pattern. They're stirring the pot, making moves in places they haven't touched in years. And you're still a threat to them, even after all this time." Joe leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "You need to tell me everything, Mark. No more games." Mark nodded, but before he could speak, the bell over the diner door jingled again. Both men turned instinctively, their eyes locking on the figure stepping inside. It was one of the bullies from earlier, not the leader, but one of his lackeys. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic, and he clutched his arm like he was in pain. He stumbled into the diner, drawing gasps from the patrons as they noticed the dark red stain spreading across his sleeve. "Help," he gasped, his voice shaky. They're coming." Joe was on his feet in an instant, his years of training kicking in. He moved to the young man, steadying him as he lowered him into a chair. "What happened?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The young man's eyes darted around the room, his breathing rapid. We didn't mean for it to go this far. They just told us to mess with you, to see what you'd do. But then he broke off, his voice cracking as tears filled his eyes. They said we failed. They said we had to pay. Mark was already by Joe's side, his expression grim. Joe, this is it. This is the message they wanted to send. Joe's stomach churned as he looked at the terrified young man. He didn't doubt the kid was telling the truth. Whoever was behind this wasn't playing games, they were escalating, and they didn't care who got hurt in the process. The sound of tires screeching outside drew everyone's attention. Joe turned toward the window, his heart pounding as he saw another car pull into the lot. The sleek black vehicle was similar to Mark's SUV, but there was nothing polished about the way it sped toward the diner, coming to a halt with a jarring screech. Joe glanced at Mark, who nodded, already reaching for something inside his jacket. Get ready, Mark said quietly. Joe didn't need to be told twice. He had tried to leave this life behind, but now it was clear he had no choice but to face it again. The diner fell silent as the car doors opened, and 3 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark clothes, their movements purposeful and coordinated. The lead man had a cold, calculating expression, his eyes scanning the diner before locking onto Joe. Joe's grip tightened on the edge of the table. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted wasn't one he wanted to see. Mark's voice broke the silence, low and steady. This is it, Joe. They're here for you. Joe nodded, his mind already racing through options. He didn't know how this was going to end, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going down without a fight. The tension in the diner was suffocating, every patron frozen in place as the 3 men stepped through the door. Their movements were calm, deliberate, and eerily synchronized. The leader, a man with a shaved head and sharp features, scanned the room with cold precision before his eyes landed on Joe. You've been hard to find, he said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to silence even the quiet murmur of the diner's customers. But not anymore. Joe didn't flinch, his expression unreadable as he slowly rose from his chair. His body was calm, but every muscle was coiled, ready to react. He had faced men like this before, and he knew the danger they posed. What do you want? Joe asked, his voice steady. The leader smirked, taking a step closer. It's not about what we want, Joe. It's about what you've already taken. You thought you could disappear, but some debts don't get forgotten. And today, we're here to collect. Mark stepped forward, his posture tense, one hand hovering near his jacket. If this is about the past, you're making a mistake, he said firmly. Joe doesn't owe you or anyone else anything. The leader shifted his gaze to Mark, his smirk fading. You should have stayed out of this, Mark. But I guess you've always had a hard time knowing when to quit. The room felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with unspoken threats. Joe's mind raced, analyzing the situation. The men weren't here to talk, that much was clear. They were here to make a statement, and Joe knew that if he didn't act quickly, innocent people could get caught in the crossfire. You came all this way for me, Joe said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Let's take this outside. No need to drag these folks into it. The leader raised an eyebrow, glancing around the diner. The patrons were watching with wide eyes, their fear palpable. After a long moment, he nodded. Fine. But don't think for a second that you're in control here. Joe turned to Mark, his voice low. Stay here. Make sure they don't try anything stupid. Mark hesitated, clearly torn, but he finally nodded. Be careful. Joe stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a slap. The parking lot was eerily quiet, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot the only noise as the 3 men followed him out. The leader stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets as he studied Joe. You know, the leader said, almost conversationally, they told us you were dangerous. That you were the kind of man who couldn't be intimidated.
But looking at you now, I'm starting to wonder if they were wrong. Joe didn't respond, his eyes locked on the man's every movement.
He knew this was all part of the game, words meant to unsettle, to create doubt. But Joe had faced worse than this, and he wasn't about to back down. The leader took a step closer, his smirk returning. "So, what's it going to be, Joe? Are you going to make this easy, or are we going to have to remind you why you should have stayed gone?" Joe's answer came in the form of swift, calculated action. Before the man could react, Joe lunged forward, his movements a blur of precision honed by years of training. The first punch landed squarely on the leader's jaw, sending him staggering back. The other two men moved quickly, but Joe was faster. He spun, blocking one attacker's swing and countering with a sharp elbow to the ribs. The third man tried to grab him from behind, but Joe shifted his weight, using the momentum to throw him to the ground. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The three men lay groaning on the ground, their confidence shattered. Joe stood over them, his breathing steady, his expression calm but unyielding. "You came here thinking you knew who I was," Joe said, his voice low. "But you didn't. Now you do." The leader struggled to his feet, his face a mix of anger and fear. "This isn't over," he spat. "You have no idea what's coming." Joe stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You tell whoever sent you that if they want me, they can come find me themselves. But next time, they won't get a warning." The leader glared at him but said nothing, motioning for his men to retreat. They stumbled to their car, the sound of the engine roaring to life breaking the silence. As the car sped away, Joe turned to see Mark stepping out of the diner. His expression was a mix of relief and frustration. "You really know how to make a statement," Mark said, shaking his head. Joe gave a faint smile. Some things never change. But as they walked back toward the diner, Joe couldn't shake the leader's final words. "You have no idea what's coming." Inside, the patrons were slowly returning to their meals, the tension in the room easing. Emily approached Joe hesitantly, her eyes wide. "Are you okay?" Joe nodded. "Yeah. It's over." But even as he said the words, a part of him knew the truth. This was far from over. As he sat down at the counter, his mind racing, Mark leaned in close. "Joe," he said quietly, "there's something I didn't tell you." Joe looked at him sharply, his instincts on high alert. "What is it?" Mark hesitated, then said, "Those guys? They weren't just here for you. They were here for both of us. And they weren't working alone." Joe felt a chill run down his spine. The fight in the parking lot hadn't been the end. It was only the beginning. Joe leaned back in his chair at the counter, his thoughts churning. Mark's revelation weighed heavily on him, confirming what he'd suspected all along. This wasn't a simple vendetta. It was bigger, more calculated. The men who came for him weren't amateurs, and their purpose ran deeper than old grudges. "I need you to start talking," Joe said, his voice calm but firm. Mark hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the countertop. He glanced around the diner, ensuring no one was listening too closely, before leaning in. "There's a network," he began quietly. "It's not just about you, Joe. These people, they're tied to something larger. Smuggling, extortion, weapons, you name it. They've been rebuilding under the radar for years. And they see you as a threat to all of it." Joe stared at him, his jaw tightening. "I've been out of the game, Mark. I haven't even thought about those people in a decade." "Why now?" Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because someone in that network still sees you as the man who tore their world apart. Maybe they think you're a loose end, or maybe it's personal. I don't have all the answers. But I do know they're ramping up, and they won't stop until you're out of the way." Joe glanced toward the window, his gaze distant. The peaceful, quiet life he had built for himself suddenly felt fragile, as if it could crumble at any moment. He thought of the young man who had stumbled into the diner earlier, terrified and bleeding, used as a pawn by people who didn't care about the consequences.
Do they know about this place? Joe asked, his voice lower now. Mark nodded reluctantly. If they don't yet, they will soon. You standing up to them today was a message they'll take personally. They'll escalate. Joe stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window and stared out at the empty parking lot. The memory of the fight was fresh in his mind, the precision of the attacks, the cold resolve in the men's eyes. They weren't just hired muscle, they were professionals. Then we finish this, Joe said quietly. Mark blinked, surprised. What are you talking about? I mean, we stop waiting for them to come to us. We end this now, on our terms, Joe replied, turning to face him. I've spent years running from who I was, trying to live a normal life. But they've made it clear they won't let me. So, if they want a fight, we'll give them one. Mark frowned, clearly uneasy. Joe, you know what they're capable of. This isn't just about throwing punches in a parking lot. They'll come at you with everything they've got. I know, Joe said simply. But I'm not going to let them destroy what I've built here. Not without a fight. Mark studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. What's the plan? The next few days were a blur of preparation. Joe and Mark worked in secret, carefully gathering information and assembling what they needed. Joe reached out to a few old contacts, people he trusted from his past who still owed him favors. Meanwhile, Mark tapped into his own network, piecing together the identities of the men who had come after them and the larger organization pulling the strings. It wasn't long before they had a target, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city that served as a hub for the group's operations. It was heavily guarded, but Joe knew it was their best chance to cut the head off the snake before things spiraled further out of control. The night of the operation arrived quickly. Joe and Mark parked a safe distance from the warehouse, the quiet hum of the city in the background. Mark glanced at Joe as they prepared to move. You sure about this? He asked. Joe nodded, his expression calm but resolute. It's the only way. The two men moved silently through the shadows, their movements deliberate and calculated. They avoided the main entrances, slipping through a side access point Mark had scouted earlier. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and machinery, the air thick with the scent of oil and metal. They worked quickly, planting small devices in key locations, distractions to draw attention away from their real objective. Joe's heart pounded in his chest as he moved, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. It wasn't long before the guards noticed something was off. A muffled explosion echoed from the far side of the warehouse, followed by shouts and hurried footsteps. Joe and Mark used the chaos to their advantage, slipping deeper into the facility. Their goal was a small office at the center of the warehouse, where the group's leader was rumored to oversee operations. As they approached, the tension in the air was palpable. Joe could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of everything that had led him here. They reached the office, and Joe motioned for Mark to cover him. He pushed the door open, his eyes scanning the room. Inside, a man sat at a desk, his expression calm despite the commotion outside. You've been busy, the man said, his voice smooth and measured. Joe stepped inside, his gaze locked on the man. It ends here. The man smirked, leaning back in his chair. You think taking me out will solve anything? This organization is bigger than you can imagine. Cutting off one head only makes room for another. Maybe, Joe replied. But I've got to start somewhere. The confrontation was brief but intense. The leader wasn't as composed as he appeared, and it didn't take long for Joe to gain the upper hand. By the time the police arrived, tipped off anonymously by Mark, the warehouse was in disarray, its operations exposed for the world to see. As Joe and Mark slipped away into the night, the weight of what they had done began to sink in. They had struck a blow against the organization, but they knew it wasn't the end. In the weeks that followed, Joe returned to the diner, resuming the quiet life he had fought so hard to protect. Mark stayed in town for a while, keeping an eye on things and helping to ensure that the group didn't try to retaliate. One evening,
As Joe was wiping down the counter, Emily approached him with a hesitant smile. "You've been different lately," she said. Joe looked up at her, a faint smile playing at his lips. "How so?" "You seem lighter," she replied. "Like you've made peace with something." Joe nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe I have." He didn't tell her everything about the fight, the warehouse, or the risks he had taken to keep the diner safe. But as he looked around at the familiar faces of his customers, he knew he had made the right choice. For the first time in years, Joe felt like he could truly move forward. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. And as he watched the sun set over the quiet streets of the town, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found peace.